Hello, friends. Welcome to 15 Minutes in the Book of Revelation. I'm Pastor Chester Hitchcock, and in this series, we're going to be walking through the book of Revelation one chapter at a time in 15-minute intervals. In this second part of this series, we're going to be dealing with verses 11, 12, and 13, primarily 12 and 13. But if you were here for the first part, the first 11 verses of the book of Revelation are written very clear and precise and straightforward, and although each verse is extremely rich in symbolism, anyone reading these verses, whether they have only an elementary education or a PhD, they will be able to understand the gist of what is happening, who is speaking, and the situation that John is in when the message comes to him on the Isle of Patmos. In verse 11, even though the voice John heard was like the sound of a trumpet, which in and of itself is full of symbolism, nevertheless, the voice is very clear and straightforward as to what John is to do. Write down what you see in a scroll and send it to the seven churches. On the other hand, beginning with verse 12 and continuing through verse 16 and even into verse 20, John tries to describe what he saw and uses symbolism that for many of us living in the 21st century we're oblivious to. Therefore, we find ourselves faced with questions as to the meaning of the symbols and how an understanding of this part of this passage can assist us as we read through the rest of the book. So as we look at each one of these symbols, I will apply the different principles. As I mentioned in the last video, there are basically 10 principles of interpretation that scholars in the past and the present have used, and I will apply those, as well as periodically sharing a quotation from a commentary, though commentaries do not always agree. But looking at this first symbol, beginning with verse 12, as John turns to see whose voice it is that spoke to him, he says, "And when I turned, I saw 7 standing lamps of gold," one translation says. Another says 7 lampstands, or another 7 candlesticks. This is the first of 6 primary symbols that we find from verse 12 to verse 16. This symbol is revealed or explained to us in verse 20, as well as the symbol of the 7 stars, which we'll deal with later. But chapter 1, verse 20, if you're there, look at what it says. It says the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lamps or candlesticks are the 7 churches. And I believe that the purpose of verse 20 was not just to identify 2 of the many symbols that are found in the book of Revelation, but rather to identify a principle by which to interpret other symbols as we come to them. One of these principles is that of interpreting Old Testament symbols by the New Testament way of looking at Christ, or theologians would say a New Testament Christology, and reapplying it according to the New Testament way of looking at the church. For example, an Old Testament symbol that would be synonymous with lamps would be that of light. And in the Old Testament, in Proverbs chapter 5, verse 18, for example, it says, "The path of the just is as a shining light that shineth more and more unto a perfect day." So interpreting this symbol of light by New Testament way of looking at Christ, we find this verse in the New Testament, John chapter 8, verse 12. Once again, Jesus addressed the people, "I am the light of the world," taking the Old Testament symbol that we found in Proverbs chapter 5, verse 18, and applying it to himself. You could also use the word path, because in Proverbs 5:18 it says, "The path of the just is like a shining light." In Proverbs 5:18, and we could compare that to John 14:6, where Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." The word for way in Greek is actually the word path. I am the path, the truth, and the life. So both of these Old Testament symbols, path and light, interpreted in terms of a new way of the New Testament way of looking at Christ, shows that Christ is the path of the just and the shining light. Now, to apply, for example, this Old Testament principle that we are looking at in Proverbs 5:18 to a New Testament way of looking at the church, we can turn to Matthew chapter 5, verse 14, where Jesus said to his disciples, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set upon a hill cannot be hidden." In this verse, Jesus is applying the symbol of light to those who proclaim his gospel to the world. Now, in Revelation chapter 1, the churches are symbolized as lamps or candlesticks, which are in fact the lights of the world. And another Old Testament closely related to the seven lamps or the seven candlesticks is the seven-branch candlestick or lampstand in the sanctuary that you can find in Exodus chapter 25, verse 37. And some commentators suggest that in comparing the seven lamps of Revelation chapter 1 to the seven-branch lampstand of the sanctuary in Exodus chapter 25, there is a reason that the lamps in Revelation chapter 1 are standing separated. And that is that they are symbolic not of Israel being united, but rather separate churches throughout the world. Another principle used here is that of symbolic numbers used to denote quality rather than quantity. The number 7, used in apocalyptic literature, such as in the book of Revelation, stands for perfection or entirety or completion. Therefore, the seven lamps or the seven candlesticks are the churches. It is not just seven literal churches and excluding all of the rest, but rather God's church or God's people in their entirety and in their completion. So let me summarize this first symbol. The first symbol, which are the seven standing lamps of gold, or seven lampstands, or seven candlesticks, whichever translation that you're looking at, as John points out in verse 20, are the seven churches. First century Christians would have understood this symbol because of their familiarity with the Old Testament symbol of the seven-branch candlestick in Exodus chapter 25. And the use of the apocalyptic numbers denoting quality rather than quantity, and the teaching of both Jesus and his disciples that Christians are to be the light of the world. Which brings us to symbol number 2, verse 13. And among the lamps, one like the Son of Man. It's often been said, and I mentioned this in the last lesson, that the key to understanding a book of the Bible is often found at the door. And here's a perfect example. Who is this one like the Son of Man? Well, Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, as I pointed out in the last lesson, says the revelation of Jesus Christ. So this brings us to another well-known principle of interpretation, which is what this particular verse reveals to us about Jesus. If the book of Revelation is about revealing Jesus, the revelation of Jesus Christ, then what does this particular symbol reveal to us about Jesus? Colin Brown, in his book titled The New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology, in fact, I have the 3 volumes of Colin Brown right here. In volume 3 on page 633, Colin Brown writes this, quote, Son of Man, hoi anthropou, which is Greek, is used in the New Testament 80 times with the definite article. In the Synoptic Gospels, especially Luke, the future coming of the Son of Man always indicates judgment and the parousia. Parousia means second coming. End quote. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 and forward, it tells of one like the Son of Man that was, quote, given dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all the peoples and the nations and the languages should serve him. Jesus claims that title, Son of Man. an Old Testament symbol that was recognized as standing for judge. 40 times in the Gospels alone refer to Jesus by this title, Son of Man. Now, if this was the only description John gave us concerning Jesus, this would not be good news, because the church is not, was not, and never will be worthy to stand before the judge without a mediator. But there is something different about this judge. Christ here is revealed as judge, but notice where he is. He is in their midst. He's in the midst of the churches. Matthew 18 verse 20 says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them." R.H. Charles, in Volume 1, page 27 of his commentary on Revelation, says this, quote, "When a fighting regiment knows that its commanding officer is there sharing the smoke and the heat of the battle, that awareness has a far more tonic effect than a message of encouragement conveyed to the fighters by a general seated in glory in some distant palace headquarters." End quote. So let me summarize this second symbol. This, quote, "one like the Son of Man, walking in the midst of the 7 lamps or 7 candlesticks, is symbolic of Jesus Christ as judge. But as we will see in the next symbol, Christ is not here to judge the churches. Instead, he is there in their midst as their commander to judge their enemy. Today, one might say that Jesus is wearing several hats in this vision, because although he is acting as judge, it seems that the churches are not the ones on trial. And this brings us to the third symbol, the second part of verse 13. He is robed, quote, "robed down to his feet with a golden girdle round his breasts." Robert Mounce, in his book titled The Book of Revelation on page 78, puts it this way, quote, "The Greek word translated a garment down to the foot in the American Standard Version occurs only here in the New Testament, while in all but one of its 7 occurrences in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it is used in connection with the attire of the high priest." End quote. Exodus 28 and 29 tells how Aaron and his sons were to be set apart as priests for the Lord. And God said in Exodus 28 verse 3 in the King James Version says, "Make Aaron garments to consecrate him, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office." Aaron served as high priest, and he took upon himself, as it says in Exodus 28 verse 38, quote, "blame for the shortcomings in the rites with which the Israelites offer their sacred gifts." This blame in the presence of God would have meant certain death for Aaron were it not for the garments that he wore. For these garments were a shadow patterned after those to be worn by Jesus during his priestly ministry in heaven. And the, quote, "blame for the shortcomings," in fact, were carried not upon Aaron as much as they were carried upon the garments. Aaron was merely the vehicle upon which the garments were translated into the holy place. And Aaron, along with his sons, while serving as priests, were not to enter or even approach the tent of the presence without their priestly garments for fear of incurring guilt and death. This Old Testament symbol of Christ, quote, which says, "robed down to his feet with a girdle, golden girdle round his breast," reinterpreted in terms of how we look at Christ, shows Christ walking in the midst of the 7 churches, and at the same time shows him as judge against their persecutors, taking upon himself the blame of the church's shortcomings as their high priest and their mediator. And the irony is that while these robes served to protect Aaron and his sons, and while we find meaning to this vision of Christ through the Old Testament symbol, the robe that Aaron wore finds its meaning in Christ. To say it another way, the robe gave power to Aaron, while its power came from Christ who wears it. And to say it even yet another way is that while we look at the Old Testament symbols to find meanings for the visions of Christ, Christ actually gives meaning to the Old Testament symbols. So let me summarize. This symbol of Christ, dressed in the priestly robes, would have come as great comfort to the first century Christians because it gives assurance to the churches that Christ bears the blame of their shortcomings as he walks in their midst, judging those who persecute them. Give me a thumbs up if you like it. Write in the comments any questions that you have, and I'll do my best to answer those as well. God bless. See you in the next video.